over 20 at the moment, so we'll wait for a few more people to join. Well, the numbers are creeping up, so I suggest we start with the introductions. Okay, so welcome everybody to our webinar, which today is focusing on the work of the MRSC's Population Mortality Improvements Working Party. Now, we've got 3 speakers today, and so I'd like to firstly introduce you to everybody. So first of all, speaking today, we'll have Steven Baxter. Steven is the Chief Data Scientist at Club Vita, where he leads a multidisciplinary team of statisticians and actuaries in analysing predictors of longevity, emerging trends in later life mortality, and the implications of longevity uncertainty on the financial health of pension schemes and insurers. He's a member of the MRSC, but for today's purposes, he'll be drawing on his years of experience working with pension scheme trustees and insurance companies on understanding longevity assumptions. Next up today, we have Sacha Dhamani, who is a longevity actuary with 15 years of experience of managing longevity and other demographic risks. He's worked in most areas of the longevity market, including retail, underwritten and standard, and bulk annuities, and for insurance and reinsurance companies. He is the current chair of the Actuarial Professions Mortality Research Steering Committee, otherwise known as the MRSC, and is also author of the prize-winning paper, The Nature of Longevity Risk. And finally, Cobus Daneel is a pensions actuary and specialist in longevity with Willis Towers Watson, where he acts as a mortality thought leader and leads on their postcode mortality modelling services. He's the chair of the CMI's Mortality Projections Committee. And finally, I'll be chairing today. My name is Caroline Roberts, and I'm a Senior Longevity Research and Development Manager at the Phoenix Group. I'm co-chair of the Longevity and Mortality Actuaries Member Interest Group on the MRSC Committee, and I'm also a member of the Population Improvements Working Party. So welcome everyone. And as I say, so we've got 3 people along to talk to us today. And so I'd like to start with Steven, who is going to introduce us to cause of death modelling.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Caroline, for that introduction. It's my great pleasure to be invited today to speak about the role of cause of death data and to introduce the great work that Sacha and his team at the Mortality Research Steering Committee have done on cause of death data. Now, traditionally, our profession has focused on what we might call gravestone data, the key dates of birth and death. These are important to us in setting baseline mortality assumptions, and of course there we often differentiate by different groups of people. And when it comes to projecting mortality improvements, we often rely on the CMI Mortality Projections Model. That's also based on gravestone data, this time for England and Wales, split between men and women. And in my experience, when we talk about longevity improvements, we often contextualize the discussion with graphics like these. Here we're looking at the period life expectancy for individuals in England and Wales, from birth on the left-hand chart, from 65 on the right-hand chart. And quite often we would see these charts annotated similar to the way I've done. This is to provide context on what has been driving the progression of increasing life expectancy. On the left-hand chart, we see how life expectancy from birth has been increasing since the 1840s. And of course, we have the dips for the World Wars, but otherwise, are generally an upward trend. Now, the chart plateaus a little in recent times and certainly exhibits a slowdown in gradient over the last 40 or 50 years. And this reflects how the early years improvements were through the successful combating of contagious infectious diseases, specifically for factors such as better sanitation, housing, awareness of good health habits. And then as we enter the 20th century, we get breakthroughs in vaccines. For example, in the late 1920s, we get the discovery of penicillin. All of these fueling an increase in life expectancy. And as we go past the Second World War, we see the introduction of the National Health Service before we enter an era where we began to appreciate the negative health effects of smoking. We had a period of smoking cessation, and of course, as we enter the 1980s, increased blood pressure monitoring, arrival of statins, etc. And all of which led to a dramatic fall in mortality from cardiovascular disease, a specific cause of death, and I'll return to that shortly. And whilst recently there have been less dramatic increases in life expectancy at birth, the extra survival we've seen has come at more advanced ages. And this has led to very significant increases in life expectancy at age 65, at least up to the start of the 2010s, when of course we saw material slowing down of those increases in older age life expectancy. But these charts, whilst they help us contextualize longevity patterns, they really still focus on that macro level gravestone data. We and the clients we serve in the industry appreciate that everyone dies from some specific cause. Many of us would have had personal experience of seeing the death certificates of family members. Now, this is clearly a fictitious example, but we see it covers such information as the primary cause of death, here being heart attack, which was with a related condition of diabetes. But also note below the heart attack and diabetes, there's a secondary space for additional conditions that can be added onto the death certificate. And this becomes very important when we're wanting to explore cause of death data. Now, this cause of death information that death certificates holds is important. The recipients of actuarial advice on mortality projections tend to anchor their assessments of the reasonableness of these assumptions to real life events. Many times in my career, I've had questions like, so, does this mean you're assuming a cure for cancer in your projections? Or, if longevity is going to be increasing that much, what will people be dying from in the future? And this tends to take us away from macro level information to the more micro level information of the actual causes of death. And therefore, in answering this, it is often helpful to reference the underlying cause of death data and pull patterns therein. Now, these two charts show the broad progression over time for different broad causal groups of age standardized mortality. Look at England and Wales here, ages are 65 plus, and the mortality being expressed as a rate per 100,000 lives. Now, the power of such charts is that we can immediately see the strong downward trend in the green line, circulatory cardiovascular diseases. And it's also evident that that line in recent times has started to level off. In many ways, inevitably, the strong, almost linear downward trend could not continue forever. Were it to do so, we'd have ultimately reached negative mortality rates from cardiovascular disease, akin perhaps to a Hollywood zombie movie. Charts like this can be incredibly helpful, though, because we can ask ourselves what might be reasonable trajectories for these different causes of death to follow in the future. And in doing so, it helps us to reframe discussions with stakeholders in a way which is much more intuitive. For example, it enables us to describe how assuming a long-term rate of, say, 1.5% per annum in the CMI model is equivalent to a particular combination of reductions in mortality from individual causes of death. And we can give a time frame to that over, say, the next few decades. And similarly, for those of us working in life insurance and needing to describe reserving models and Solvency II risk models, it's often a powerful way to describe such things as the 90th percentiles of risk. We can describe it in terms of scenarios. For example, whereby if events A and B were to happen, then this would lead to impact X on life expectancy. And this leads me to perhaps one of the most powerful uses of cause of death data. It enables us to think through scenarios effectively of the cause of death. So whilst individuals all die of something, there will be an underlying pathway that led to that death. Now, an example on screen is perhaps one of the most obvious of these: smoking. We know that smoking is a significant risk factor for heart attacks and can lead to lung cancer. So we can consider such questions as how have smoking patterns changed by generation? What will these be in the future? And that enables us to consider the impact of these changes on different causes of deaths, heart attacks, lung cancer, and in turn, how overall mortality rates might change as a consequence. Now, in the 1950s, Richard Dole published his landmark paper on smoking as a possible causal factor in lung cancer. And had we considered a cause of death approach in, say, the 1970s, following Dole's paper and the subsequent gradual cessation of smoking, perhaps we could have better predicted the cohort effect as a profession. Of course, there's lots of reasons why we didn't do it at that time, including the availability of good data and the materiality of longevity risk in many of the actuarial calculations of the time. But the world has moved on, and the use of cause of death models and the cause of death models has become much more prevalent in mortality and longevity work. But their use relies on good quality data and an appreciation of how to interpret that data. Many organisations have invested in purchasing causal data sets or working with population level data and attempting to clean it up. And those of you who have worked in this area will be all too aware of the challenges in using such data. Firstly, it's really important to think about how you wish to group the causes of death. Whilst it's natural to say group cancers together, the etiology of cancers is very different. And if the purpose is to model the underlying risk factors and changes in behaviours, then it will be important to group causes of deaths differently. For example, maybe thinking about how smoking is a risk factor for multiple causes of death, or diet. Secondly, we saw in my charts earlier some clear cliff edges in the time series where the individual causes went down and after a period came back up again. These were caused by changes to the International Classification of Diseases, ICD protocols, over time. And what's in my charts, I was simply plotting the raw data. Those wishing to model cause of death data robustly need to think about the consistency of the data over time. And finally, we're often most interested in mortality at older ages, by which time most individuals have multiple morbidities. This introduces several complexities. Are the causes of death consistently recorded on death certificates? How do we interpret a death certificate where there are multiple contributing causes cited? And when it comes to projecting mortality, how do we allow for competing risks? For example, material advances can reduce the morbidity and mortality from a specific cause, but the multiple morbidities of old age mean that the Grim Reaper is often queuing up with another cause of death to take people to their grave. Now, for me, the really exciting thing about the work that the MRSC have done under Sacha's stewardship is to create a cleaned data set for widespread use, which seeks to directly address these challenges. Now, I don't want to steal Sacha's thunder in terms of that data set and how he's addressed the challenges. So maybe over to you, Sacha, to share the MRSC's work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephen. That was a really great overview to introduce us. Now, just before Sacha comes in, I completely forgot to mention, we would love to have as many questions as possible. So you should see a chat box at the bottom. So please send through your questions as you think of them. Great. And now over to you, please, Sacha.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Stephen. I'd sort of like to start. So firstly, I'm not going to attempt to go through all the detail. There's a lot that went into this piece of work to produce a new drivers and mortality data set. So what I'm going to attempt to do is give you a sort of good overview of what we've been doing and some of the key highlights. But I'd also like to sort of point out, whilst I'm here presenting this, I'm representing the working party, which has where a number of people have been involved and done some fantastic work, which I in no way should take all the credit for. There are probably too many people for me to thank and sort of commend on this, but I would like to sort of highlight the work of Nana Ajima, who's done the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of the data processing. He's been trapped in an SRS safe pod for most of the last year. We don't let it come out much. but he's done most of the work to sort of process the data, and I'll speak a little bit more about what the SRS is in a moment. So as Caroline says, please ask any questions, and I'll try and pick up the things that you're interested in rather than the things that I might want to be interested in. So if I can just get going on. So in terms of the purpose of this development, as Stephen mentioned, on the death certificate, there are a number of mentions, perhaps up to 15 we've found, and we generally get cause of death data at a single cause level, which means that effectively the ONS has used whatever ICD regime they're using to turn that into a single value. So they've got their methodology they're producing standard statistics for to be consistent, but in terms of our purpose potentially for modeling, perhaps doesn't quite give us what we're looking for. So we said ourselves, well, let's go and have a look at that mention level data and see if we can extract some more value out of that to create a data set which is more bespoke for our purposes. One example of that is that we want to focus more on the cause of death rather than the event of death, and I'll come back onto that one in a minute. And that we wanted to group by driver. So as Stephen was saying, sort of the cause of cause, we wanted to group the deaths by into clusters which had common factors, such that the sort of projection modeling that we might want to do naturally inclined to that. The success of that is obviously challenging. But one thing we have brought in, which we wouldn't necessarily find in the ONS published statistics, is comorbidity. And finally, as Stephen was saying, there are those discontinuities. We wanted to see how well we can clean those up and create a consistent mapping over time. Obviously, there is reporting practice on the death certificate which we can't sort of effectively extract from the data. But in terms of the raw data that the ONS captures at the sort of 15 mention level, we can make sure that we're mapping that consistently over time, and that has proved to be one of the significant benefits. So in terms of the methodology, to access this data, we need to set up a secure research service project, i.e. we gain access to the ONS's sort of raw data. Now we have to do that, as I was saying, in a safe room, so that's a secure environment, no internet access. You can't save things, you're not even allowed a telephone, you have to do it in effectively what looks like a very small dungeon. But it does mean we get to access the data. Now in terms of getting the data out, any work we do is produced in that environment, and then the ONS clears it for a release. So that's given us quite privileged access to better data. We've been able to access individual death records and the multiple mentions, up to 50 mentions. We've been able to access the ONS's mapping to cause, so we could look at that, and a number of things in terms of coroner's. So we had quite detailed access, but only in that environment. So that's allowed us to start with that mention level data. And the first thing we did was map from ICD code to cause. That made it more manageable. And then we managed, and that was still at the mention level. And then we mapped from those causes, those multiple causes for each death, to a single driver. Now, the reason we did that is that there are significant disclosure restrictions. We can't publish the underlying data. We need to get it into a form where we're satisfying the ONS's disclosure restrictions. So that means we've had to restrict the number of drivers and restrict ourselves to a single driver. So that is a compromise. But that's where we wanted to make sure we had, at best, we had a single year of age by calendar year, by gender, such that from a modeling point of view it was useful. But it does mean we've had to restrict the data. We've also had to constrain the edges of the data for an age band. But the overall result is a data set we think is more usable, more appropriate for our actuarial purposes than what we've currently had available in the past. So just sort of talking briefly about the causes and driver, we've mapped the ICD codes to about 80 causes. That's a large enough group to capture the granularity, but a small enough group that it is manageable when we're trying to map to our drivers. These are intended to be relatively static, relatively factual, but then we take those and map those to the drivers. Now these are an interpretation. They're intended to equate to the underlying risk factors that would drive and differentiate between groups of causes where the risk factor effect would vary. This was subject to a lot of debate, in terms of the working party. Different views were expressed. When we took the paper to the MRSC, there was again different views. So the drivers are an interpretation. If we got 20 longevity actuaries in the room, they probably come up with 30 different driver groups. And the other thing I would say about this is I wouldn't necessarily expect the driver groups to be static over time. I would expect that they would need refinement and revision depending on what's coming through, such that as different risk factors emerge and become more or less relevant, the driver groups would map. Whereas the causes I would expect to stay more static. And coming back to that, I talked about we wanted to focus more on cause rather than events. So that meant when we were looking at the multiple mentions, we would look to what we thought was causing the death rather than the event. So that means we've increased the sort of allocation of deaths to things like Alzheimer's and dementia, diabetes and obesity, but we've reduced the allocation to things like pneumonia, strokes and infections, where they were more likely to be the event of death caused by an underlying health condition. So that means that the data does look different from the ONS data, but more appropriate from a risk factor point of view. And if I just sort of give you a summary of what the mix of drivers are, there are 13 drivers, as I've mentioned, and there's 2 or 3 things I'll sort of call out. One is that the other category is relatively small, almost 10%. That means that sort of that bundle of sort of heterogeneous causes and drivers is relatively constrained. We've managed to the proportion of Alzheimer's and dementia is obviously quite high at 10%, so that's good. And one of the most interesting ones is the comorbidity group, which you can see is sort of 15%. So that's obviously quite a key change and quite a significant piece. If I focus on how those vary over time, now there are lots of interesting patterns in the data, and I'm not going to attempt to sort of even cover any of this in any detail, but I think what the most key message from this chart is how that the discontinuities we've seen for various classification regimes in the past, since 2000, have largely been resolved. Say the reporting practice changes by the recording of the death certificate obviously going to be present, but in terms of the mapping of that death certificate to the output ICD codes in some of the data we've got from other sources, the 2011 change, the 2014, we've largely managed to clean that away, and by applying a consistent mapping over time. So the data is looking far more continuous than it was before. And now there's couple of things that I would like to highlight, which probably sort of exemplify what you'll see in this data if you come to use it. One is comorbidity. So one of the things you can see is over the sort of last 20 years, we're defining comorbidity here to be 3 or more major causes, is that how significantly it's increased. Now, whilst undoubtedly some of this is to do with reporting changes, we would expect the level of comorbidity to have increased as people are surviving and reaching older ages. So how we think about this is quite important from going forward. So we now have this in the data. Possibly it's something that we'll have to look at in the future in terms of whether this group, this driver is so big, if it continues on that kind of upward trajectory of a way of partitioning it further. But for this first sort of cut of the data, it does give us sort of a possibility of extra insight we didn't have before. The other one I'd sort of like to highlight is diabetes and obesity. And what this chart is showing is sort of various potential cuts of the data. These variations are available in the data set. We're publishing with 3 or 4 variants, our primary variant, but a couple of alternatives to allow people to explore. And what you can see is, in terms of the standard ONS primary ICD code mapping, the number of diabetes and obesity deaths is relatively low. Because we focused on the cause, we just took that directly through ignoring comorbidity, you would see the purple line, a sort of a much higher number of deaths and an increasing number of deaths, which sort of seems in line with what we're expecting from diabetes and obesity more generally in terms of the increased prevalence. But once we take out comorbidity, we see that sort of paler blue line, which shows that diabetes and obesity potentially hasn't increased, and it's the effect of combination of causes alongside diabetes and obesity which is causing the issue. So this gives us new and different insights. What this means for the future and what we should conclude is obviously going to, down to the individual practitioner in their own model, but at least it gives you the ability to sort of, look at the question from different perspectives. Okay, so I'll say there's lots more information I could talk about but I've tried to just give you a flavor of what we've done and what it produced. There's going to be a full derivation paper that's been produced by the MRSC, which will be available via the IFoA website shortly. We're in the process of just getting that through the final governance. The data set itself will be hosted by the CMI. If we sort of flip our attention back to the sort of twin sides of the coin, the MRSC tends to focus its attention on information and methodology, whereas the CMI focuses its attention on models and data. So you think it's appropriate all mortality data should be via the same source, and the CMI, Cobus and others have been involved in the working party, so they've been sort of giving us their opinions all the way through. Once the data and the paper are published, we're expecting a level of informal consultation. We're welcoming feedback in terms of what we see, how we can potentially improve for the future. The working party, will want to look at how and when the data set should be refreshed. The drivers that we've chosen are not the right answer. They're an answer, and it might be that there's strong consultation feedback that a different grouping appropriate, and we should look at that. But the intention is that this data will be periodically updated, whether that's once a year, once every 2 years, I think is still to be debated. It will depend on sort of how much interest there is in the data, but that is the expectation, not just that we produce an updated data, but we refine the drivers in response to user feedback as we go along. And one final thing, just a sort of quick plug for the working party. Now we've got this data, we want to move on to the next stage, which is using this data. So there's sort of going to be two strands to the working party going forward. One is looking at the data and the modeling of how to process the data into projections models and hopefully prediction models. But also one looking at the scenario analysis that can be done on this data. So if you're interested in getting involved, then we would definitely be looking for more volunteers to swell our ranks and take this work forward. And with that, I'll hand back to Caroline.
Great, thank you. Now, I think there's just one quick question, so I think we'll perhaps just nip to this question, because it might be a quick one for you to answer, Sacha, before we move on. How far back does this data set go?
So we've taken the data from 2000 and we extracted it in 2023, which gave us data up to 2022, which we cut off at 2021 because we're using year of occurrence. We just want to make sure that we got that right. It's theoretically possible that we could go back further, but we took 2000 so that we're on a single ICD regime, ICD 10, to make the task easier, but theoretically it is possible to go back further.
Great, thanks for that, Sacha. Great, thank you. Okay, so and I'll just invite Cobus to have a chat to us, just to give us an oversight of the role that the CMI has and will be playing in this.
Right, thank you, Caroline. And I don't have any slides, unfortunately. You'll have to just look at me. So I think Sacha did touch on a sort of a quite an important question that I often get asked is, why does the Institute have both a CMI, Continuous Mortality Investigation, and a separate group, the Mortality Research Steering Committee? Why is there that separation? And the simple answer is the different focuses. So where the CMI is funded by subscribers and very much focuses on practical tools and resources that we make available to the subscribers to use in their own immediate work. The MRSC is more free to explore new developments. So how I can describe it is that anything that the CMI would do, we try to be as forward-looking as possible, but we'll never be right at the bleeding edge of developments, because by definition, that is only a few of our users doing that at the moment, while the MRSC can really be there. And I think it is sort of an indication that we are involved almost at this early stage, is that this type of analysis we expect may become quite mainstream. In terms of hosting it, so the data, we know that our users and others in their actual profession, generally when they want information on mortality, they come to the CMI section of the IFoA web page. So that is the logical place to keep that data. We also keep data set from other sources. ONS data, sometimes I find it easier to get population data via the ONS, or sorry, via the CMI web page rather than going through via the ONS. So it is a nice place to keep it together. And hopefully that will be made available soon. I think Sacha will could give a better indication of when exactly that will happen, but it is imminent. So in terms of future support, so of course, ideally we would want a data set like this being updated quite regularly, but that will depend on how much it is used. So certainly my committee, this Mortality Projections Committee, will, as a separate user, analyze the data set, and give our thoughts on it. But my hope really is that individual users of CMI output and others in the actual profession would also use that data for their own purposes. And I would love to sort of hear feedback from that, because any sort of widespread use will support a case for actual sort of effort and resources being placed into getting that data set to be updated on a more regular basis, which could only be a positive thing. I think what is also important that Sacha mentioned is that it is a first point, it's a starting point, it's a set of drivers that we come up with. If it is used more widely and does represent sort of something that is quite useful, then I can see that we'll develop on that. So maybe alternative sort of derivations of drivers, and also extending maybe to data prior to 2000. So there is definitely room for development, but I think it's important to make a concrete step forward, use that, see how it goes, and then refine from there. And then if you can get sort of a positive momentum going, I think that sort of this type of work can go a long way. So I think that sort of concludes our interaction. So maybe the final thing I should mention is that we were involved in the project. The CMI haven't reviewed the work explicitly, so there's no sort of overall committee review of it. It is the work of a MRSC, but we have been involved through the process on an individual basis.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think on that point, it is probably worth noting that obviously we have followed all actuarial standards, and you'll see within the documentation confirmation of the standards and the TASs that have been followed. So we are all operating in line with those. Great, thanks very much for that. Now, great news is that you've got some questions coming in, so you're not stuck with my questions, which I'm sure you'll be pleased about. So that is good, because it shows some real interest. So Sacha, you've got some quite detailed ones on the data, so these are going to come to you. So the first one being about, is the data subdivided by, say, deprivation or region?
It's not, although I'll talk about what's actually, there is information relating to, I think postcode is actually in the source data. So it would be possible to partition the data in a different way. The challenge with that is the disclosure requirements, that the more we cut the data up in different ways, the more we'd be restricted. So let me give you an example. I think because of the numbers of Alzheimer's and dementia deaths being so low, there's quite a high age where we have to sort of cut off the data we can take out. I think it's sort of 47, 57, it's in that sort of territory. And that means that sort of the older ages and the younger ages, it becomes compressed. Now, we were to divide by more than 13 drivers, imagine we put in sort of 4 or 5 deprivation, that age restriction would start to increase, and at which point the usability of the data at younger ages and older ages would start to diminish. Now that might be an acceptable compromise, and certainly something but we chose to try and focus on getting the maximum age range from a driver point of view, and not on subdividing it further. But that data definitely exists in the SRS environment, and it's not impossible for the project to look at that in the future, or rather it's not impossible for a working party or the CMI to set up a further SRS project and explore that further.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so next question. You talked about reporting changes not being cleaned out of the analysis, and thinking about dementia, where we've seen a large increase. Does the work explain that increase, and about being a propensity for dementia to be mentioned rather than it being listed as the main cause?
Okay, so in the 15 mentions, and to be clear, there's not many, in fact, almost no deaths with 15 mentions, and most of them are less than 6 or 7. Alzheimer's dementia could be anywhere, in some of the 3 primary or in the secondary. What we've done is gone looking for Alzheimer's and dementia in some of the, in some of the, secondary causes. So for example, if they died of, pneumonia was listed as a primary cause, but Alzheimer's and dementia, we effectively promoted Alzheimer's and dementia to be the cause with an event of influenza. So in terms of the data, we've inflated Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, and obesity, for example, as well. But there is still the underlying issue of, was it mentioned at all? And there has been, to some extent at least, a reporting practice change in the last 20 years for Alzheimer's dementia, where it was some sort of impact to be listed. So that is there. Now, the effect of that is still left to the sort of practitioner to work out what level of impact, where did it increase from? What was the true level? Are we at the true level now? Is it still coming through? The data can't answer that question, but what it can do, what we are trying to do, is where it has been mentioned, give it better prominence than it was getting before. Hopefully that's sort of answered the question.
Yeah, hopefully so. Brilliant. And hopefully, I think it's quite an easy one to answer. So the 80 cause to 13 drivers, that isn't a mapping that can be changed, no, is it? Do you want to explain why?
No, because again, it's down to the disclosure requirements. I mean, you can see in sort of on the 13 drivers, things like the comorbidity, cardiovascular, other, that they're over 10% of the deaths between 2000 and 2021. But some of the more granular causes are quite low, and we'd end up hitting the disclosure restrictions such that we just end up compressing. So the 80 causes, or the 80 plus causes, is designed to give us something manageable to map to the drivers. If we took the ICD codes and tried to map those to the drivers directly, we'd end up with a horrendously complex mapping. So we've broken it down into 2 stages just to make it a little bit more transparent. So the users can see what are the 80 causes, and the mapping to the 13 drivers is explained in the derivation paper, but it's not something you can change directly in the dataset. Only the drivers are present. However, the informal consultation will probably lead, I would hope, to opinions on the drivers, and we may need, ideally change those drivers over time in response to sort of a common view.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, well, I hope that we do get some good feedback and consultations. It will certainly make the next stage a lot easier. Okay, so everyone, please carry on asking questions. I don't think we've got any current questions. Robert has said thank you for your explanation on the dementia. So we're going to turn to my questions, and I'm going to give Sacha a break for a minute. Let's hear for some other people. So Stephen, how do you see this data set being used in practice?
Great question, Caroline. I think I see 2 immediate applications. I think the first one is in an extrapolative or modeling framework, in the sense that you've got, you can think of the England and Wales data that underpins the CMI projections model having been subdivided into essentially these 13 subpopulations, and those 13 subpopulations will have patterns within them and correlations within them. So I could well see people directly modeling on that data to do more of a bottom-up approach to projections, thinking about what a sensible extrapolation of the trends inherent in that data is, and then using that to perhaps rationalize best estimates. You get a comfort with a particular configuration of the CMI model, for example, by essentially working out what set of parameters in the CMI model would be consistent with a few on the pathways of that causal data. I also see it perhaps being used in a secondary way, which is scenario analysis, because in the same way that models based upon that gravestone data tend to be extrapolative, looking in the rearview mirror of the historical data, if we were to apply those extrapolative techniques and extend them to the cause of death data, we'd still be reliant on that rearview mirror approach, and you'd obviously have to have care about not taking us into negative mortality for circulatory disease and things. The scenario-based approach is really helpful here, though, because it can say, well, what if, when I'm thinking about, say, the event risk framework within Solvency II, and I'm wanting to understand what would happen if certain events were to happen in the future, they're not in the historical data. We've got no immediate way of specifically modeling them in the historical data, but we can postulate that if X, Y, and Z were to have this kind of impact, what might it mean on different causes of death? So, for example, in the news recently has been the potential wider benefits of Ozempic and for diabetes, obesity, and onwards onto cardiovascular disease. This framework of creating the linkages through from obesity could help answer some scenario-based questions on that. Similarly, what about the recent breakthroughs in cancer vaccines? We don't yet have that in the data set as a specific model point, but we can say how, if they were to follow a natural progression, what could that lead to changes in mortality rates, and how much of our presumed best estimate or risk event is explained by those kind of eventualities.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Cobus, do you anything to add to that?
Very much the same. I would say yes, definitely scenario analysis, and for me, scenario analysis comes first. A scenario analysis is helpful to determine likely impacts. It may not help you determine the likelihood of that impact, but it helps you understand what is the magnitude of a certain eventuality. That naturally leads further on then to more detailed modeling, which tries to sort of put a probability on that, and that will happen in the longer term. Also, for the immediate use of it, I can see it being used to help inform something that the CMI hasn't really provided to users, and that's sort of a way to inform a good best estimate long-term rate. So getting a handle of what is sort of driving mortality now and how that may change may lead to sort of at least some way of setting or just informing the decision on long-term rates. So that is also a thing that I think people need to think about.
Great, thank you. Sacha, have they missed anything? No? Okay, what I'll do is I'll move on to the next question. And actually this kind of alludes a little bit to the question just come through as well. So maybe we can just talk about these drivers and maybe just discuss how we came up with the grouping of the deaths into the different driver groups. And then kind of, as Robert said, is it a consideration that we could kind of look into kind of like changing that mix of driver groups and age, so kind of like to get more driver groups and less age granularity?
Yeah, shall I pick that one up?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the starting points for this piece of work was sort of a discussion between various members of the MRSC when the working party was set up, in terms of, right, what did we want to achieve? Did we want, what do we want to do about competing risks? Did we want to bring comorbidity in? How did we want to tackle how we group things? And the decision was, right, we want to focus on the causes rather than the events. So there were various sort of, a subcommittee of the MRSC took this away and violently disagreed about everything we should possibly do. And we hammered it out for a while and eventually sort of agreed, right, let's do something workable. So in no sense do I think you'll find a single, individual person who would agree with every single last bit of how we split the drivers up or the causes of them happen, but there is sort of common agreement that it's workable, and something we would benefit the wider actuarial community. And that doesn't mean that sort of we'll gain 90% approval. I think everyone will disagree and agree with different bits. um and it will evolve. And as we've gone through the project, sort of, various people have got involved at various stages as we designed this and kicked the tires, and then we went back to the MRC with the final bit. There was again, sort of disagreement and challenge from various bits. So I think it's important that no one believes that this is the definitive IFoA view of drivers. It is, a workable function. It should be viewed as transitory. It should evolve over the time. And I have spotted the question from Robert, regarding whether, sort of we can trade age granularity for drive. I think absolutely that's a question. Definitely, it's not impossible. We're subject to the disclosure restrictions, but within that, it is about chopping things up. I mean, for example, having now seen the data, where would I be thinking next is potentially an important one for the future. Might be partitioning comorbidity. I think that might, but I think in terms of the other group, obviously you can see sort of some of the smaller ones, the infections were at 1, 2, 3% of deaths. There's a diminishing level of return of what can be got out of that other group. But repartitioning to sort of, for the changing risk factors might come in and it might change the dynamic. But I think consideration of how comorbidity should be treated over the next sort of 5 years if the dataset gains common usage will be a key question. I could easily see that being partitioned into 2 or 3 sub drivers. Perhaps what is the leading driver within the comorbidity driver.
Great, thank you. Now, Anil's, so we're sticking on the driver classification. I think this just goes to show this absolutely is going to be the area of debate, and Anil is picked up on so an example on cancer, and I think that could be the one. I would suggest the cancer splits are possibly the one that will cause the most debate, and absolutely. So some cancers are considered to be partly caused by obesity, but kind of like, well, depends what cancer group they're in. Well, say, Anna, there is actually a group caused which is cancers caused by obesity. So, and so I'm answering this question, Sacha. I hope you don't mind. So we very much went to work carried out by cancer research and other bodies, which does actually say what the biggest drivers are of the different cancers. So there are so a cancer such as breast cancer might be caused by obesity and smoking, but there is data that says it's actually caused more by obesity than smoking. And so we have made a judgment to put it into the obesity category. But as I say, it is all set out in the document, and absolutely that would be an area of feedback. There is also, I mean, again, possibly the slightly more controversial one that has been picked up is that lung cancer. You'd think, well, that's obviously in the cancers caused by smoking category, but it's actually there is a category called cancers of unmet need, and that again is a definition by Cancer Research UK, and very much because the feeling was that actually that is a driver group that when you're projecting forward, you may struggle to think of things that is going to generally impact this group, because, as I say, it is described by Cancer Research as a disease that is very hard to treat. So things might change. And I think that goes back to what Sacha was saying earlier, how in a couple of years' time, different driver groups may be appropriate, because it may be that actually, certainly with the developments and the screening that's being rolled out, that lung cancer isn't considered a cancer of unmet need anymore. So that could be a really good example of when we might move due to triggers that are coming along. Anything to add to that I've missed, Sacha?
I think that's spot on, and sort of really does highlight the debate we've had about that one in particular, but more generally.
Yeah. Okay, carrying on with questions from the audience. So with the granularity in a socioeconomic dementia being restricted by disclosure requirements, is there anything planned to support users to ensure the relevance of the observation? Because obviously we are setting them for an insured population rather than a general population.
Sorry, can I tackle that one, because this was sort of a key question sort of right at the sort of outset when the MRSC established as a priority, that we wanted to focus on population. There were two reasons for that. Is we wanted to sort of serve the public interest side of things, so that what analysis, that anything that was produced in this vein was population, so relevant to the wider interest group. And the other side of it is we definitely didn't want to effectively publish for free what we do commercially. The MRSC should not be effectively a replacement for actuarial services, but it should supplement and support actual services. And if we started trying to sort of opine on insured populations, there is an implicit, so it should be relevant for insured populations. Well, but every insured population is potentially different, and it might give the impression that it's right for every single one. And we know that sort of, there's that those kind of benchmarking practices really are unhelpful to the individual practitioner. So we wanted to shy away from trying to claim relevance and leave it to the individual practitioner to determine how to sort of apply it to an insured population. Hopefully that makes sense, and I haven't said anything too controversial on that, but we were trying to steer very much in that we're talking about the population.
Great. And sticking to socioeconomics, can it be combined with socioeconomic factors such as income levels?
I think possibly I covered this one before, but I'll just to repeat it, as I do think postcode's in the data, so it could be mapped. But again, it's come back to the where do you buy granularity and where do you sort of lose granularity? That's a decision to be made. But it does exist in the data, yes.
Great. Okay, so Stephen, we're going back to my questions now. So Stephen, the groupings have been based very much on historical drivers, but how should we think about the unknown future drivers?
Huge question there. And I suppose we would start. I think it comes back to the fact that whenever we're projecting with historical data, be it the gravestone data that's in the CMI model or this cause of death data, that data has a whole series of drivers that have led to where we've got to today. And when we extrapolate it forward, we're not necessarily saying that those drivers are going to persist. They may well be replaced by other drivers. And that's where things like the scenario analysis of understanding how those replacement drivers could support a particular level of best estimate, as Cobus alluded to, long-term rate, for example, earlier, or in terms of risk distribution. It's really important to understand how some of these not yet observed drivers could flow through. I think it's always very challenging to then think about the sort of known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. The known unknowns here probably being what are going to be the biggest drivers of the future. And for me, this is where you start having to draw up a landscape of the factors that we are aware about that are already happening in society that may not yet be in the data. So what's already happening in terms of medical advances, diagnostic advances, what's happening in terms of societal behaviours? Have we seen the impact of sugar taxes coming through yet, etc.? Plus, of course, the big zeitgeist of AI and how is that going to impact the medical diagnosis, medical interventions, behaviours of the future. So to my mind, it's going to be a case of understanding those thematics that we know are going to come, that are potentially already happening, or we can realistically see happening in the near future, and feeding those through in terms of the plausible impacts and linkages on the different causes of death. And I suspect as part of doing that, we will find when we go through those thought processes that we will all disagree, as Sacha said, with the exact breakdown of the drivers. And the question will be, is it adequately fit for purpose, or would there be other ways of slicing and dicing the data that would be helpful in terms of the distinction between understanding historical patterns and understanding the sensitivities in the future. And that's why I suspect, putting words in the mouth of my MRSC colleagues, that it's probably the most important thing from the ongoing consultations, just to understand other people's perceptions of what are broad categories that are particularly helpful to the ongoing discourse and the ongoing modelling.
Right.
So if I can just sort of
Yeah,
chip in
please.
there. So,
Yep.
so any discussion about how things may and will progress in the future and about unknowns is going to be subjective. We won't ever be able to get away from it. But having the data sort of divided up into bite-sized chunks that actuaries could use to discuss with other experts that may have a particular view, a particular area of expertise, does help us to get information from a wider sort of basis and from wider expertise than just relying on a simple extrapolation of sort of high level trends. And I think that is the real value that sort of cause-based, driver-based projections brings to the party.
Great. Thanks for that, Cobus. Okay, right, Sacha, I'm going to challenge you now to give very short answers so we can get through these last few questions. So I know that outside of your comfort zone. So on the insured population point, is it possible to produce a sensitivity of only including, say, the top 5 IMD deciles?
It's certainly possible. There is disclosure restriction. There are disclosure restrictions within a data set, but also disclosure restrictions between data sets. If you construct different variants of the data and it's possible to use them together to isolate individuals, that probably would fall foul of it. So it's possible, but there are limits. Is it possible to do a similar exercise for Scottish data? Don't know. The only reason it's not included is England Wales is the ONS and the Scottish data is the GRO. Whether there's an equivalent service via the GRO, I'm not sure, but certainly, I believe the source data will be there to some extent, and it would be possible, but we haven't explored it.
Great, and I've said this one's answer, but I don't think it has been. Sorry. Is this kind of research being done by other countries or other actuarial organisations, or are we world leading, Sacha?
Oh. I'm going to pass to one of my international colleagues who probably has an awareness of what's going on in the US. Stephen, what's your perception there? Are we still world leading, or are we being caught up?
I think we are still very much at the front of the pack. I think if we were to look around the globe, the most obvious actuarial organisation that's doing something in this area is the Society of Actuaries in the US, where there's sponsored research, and also with some of the bits being done within the human mortality database of building up cause of death databases within that. I think there's a Japanese cause of death database within that, and ones for other countries. So I think it's very much as we perhaps would expect, it's an area that is being looked into across the globe because of its relevance to work across life and longevity.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask 2 more questions. I'm going to save Annals to last because it's the best. So very quickly, so it's probably a joint Cobus Sacha answer. When are we going to see this on the CMI website, approximately?
It's never been closer. To borrow a phrase from Project Land, the data is ready. We've just got to push with the governance. The paper is ready. It's just going through final review. So it is literally how quickly can we turn the wheels and get it on the website. So I would hope it's by the end of June, but I don't want to give a specific date because it's just a case of how quickly we can push it through the bureaucratic machinations.
Great. Does that sound good to you, Cobus?
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable estimate.
Fantastic. Right, so this best question for last, and that is, you mentioned that we're looking for volunteers. How can we sign up?
I think the best way is probably via the member interest group. There is a LinkedIn page and there's a website. I don't know whether we can flash it up, but contact us via that LinkedIn group. It's probably going to be quickest because it'll come directly through to Caroline and Dan. That's probably, is that right, Caroline?
Yes, certainly on the LinkedIn group, and don't know about the website, but don't worry, Anil, I know where you are.
Yeah, you volunteered now, you can't escape anymore.
Great. I think we have run out of time for questions, but I would like to thank all our speakers. As Sacha said, Sacha is very much representing a team of people behind the scenes doing a lot of work. Absolutely, Nana has been amazing, and he's done a great job being locked away in a darkened room. And hopefully this data set genuinely, I think we've had some really good questions through. So hopefully it really does show that this is actually meeting a need that people will really want to use. So as soon as the data's out, we will be following up with consultation questions, and so please engage, please use the data, please play with the data. Let us know what you think, let us know what you'd like to see in future iterations, and certainly we'll take that back to the working party. And Dan has just put on the chat there the website address, which is for the member interest group, so please contact us via there. So and there we are, bang on 3 o'clock. So thank you, everybody.